谢谢大家回谢北北时间，我是大叔长。
我是大叔甲。
呀，我们今天又找到这个另外一位也是超级厉害的讲者 Sean King， 然后而且这个是我们是才几天前刚录的，所以就是很时事这样子。不过我们还是请大叔甲跟这个大家介绍一下，这个 Sean King 是哪方神圣啊？
好，简单介绍一下，Sean King 现在是美国 Park Strategy 的资深副总。那 Park Strategy 是一个美国的顾问公司，或者是台湾常常翻成是游说或是公关公司，所以那他是负责他们公司在亚洲的业务开发跟support 他们的 client。那之前像也是亚洲的老手，他之前在美国商务部也担任过资深的亚洲顾问，然后也曾经任职于新加坡的 PwC， 就是五大会计师会计公司然后花旗银行也在台北花旗银行任职过，所以虽然他现在回到纽约，但是他对亚洲是一点都不陌生。
对。
那
是那个，不过刚才也加一句，那个大叔甲讲的太客气了。他当然Sean是顾问，不过他的顾问他是帮美国国家政策方面的顾问。
是，
所以我们今天特别请他来，也是因为他是他不是只做台湾，跟他整个亚洲状况是非常熟悉，然后他对台湾也是非常熟悉的。所以我们这一个系列其实在讲到这个所谓的这个灰色冲突啊，就是有没有什么擦枪走火。那我们这次也找了Sean King 从一个比较政策政治的角度来看这件事情。那当然另外一个也是因为就是前几天才刚录的，所以这也讨论到乌克兰跟台湾之间的这个差别或是类似的地方。那也请这个好，那我就不要再废话多说，我们现在就进入节目，我们听看 Sean King 怎么看这件事情。
Hi, this is your favorite uncles again. Today we're very, very honored to chat with Sean King calling in from not Taiwan. So welcome to our show, Sean. Please say hi to our listeners.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Great. Today, let's explore our thoughts a little bit about gray zone conflicts. And just to set the stage, by gray zone conflicts, we mean actions generally non-military or below the level of war that are taken by a hostile government to sort of destabilize or challenge other countries or regions. So with that, I will turn to my co-host, Uncle Sang, to ask the first question.
Hi, Sean. It's good to see you again. Well, you know, I think like Uncle just said, our primary topic is about in the recent conversation, there's a fair amount of discussion about gray zone conflict. But just in terms of what has happened in the past, 10 days, 2 weeks is, obviously the invasion of Ukraine. And there's a great deal of parallel being drawn by the pundits. So Sean, I mean, do you want to just kind of looking at what's going on in Ukraine and any thoughts? How does it relate to Taiwan? Not necessarily everything in detail, but just, what are the reasonable parallels, as it were?
I don't see that many parallels. I'm no Russia expert, but my sense of Vladimir Putin's view of Ukraine is that it's part of like a pan-Slavic regional family, as opposed to a domestic part of Russia, while Xi Jinping considers Taiwan a domestic part of China. And also the PRC has respect for sovereignty and borders and the laws of the UN. So you'll notice that the PRC, like with the Crimea annexation of 2014, has abstained and not openly supported Russia's invasion. Plus, taking a pretty much unguarded land border that used to be part of your country anyway from the Soviet era is completely different from crossing 100 miles of very unfriendly water and making an amphibious landing and taking over Taiwan. So I really don't see a lot of the parallels. Also, as you know, President Biden said from the outset that the United States was not going to military involve itself in Ukraine. Well, Taiwan, most likely we would under so-called strategic ambiguity, so long as it wasn't Taiwan provoking the fight. And, you know, Ukraine is not that important to the outside world, I'm very sorry to say. Meanwhile, Taiwan is an important plug and brick in the wall of the first island chain, and also much more important economically to the world. So I do think the United States, its friends and allies would defend Taiwan, again, so long as it wasn't Taipei provoking the dispute. But I think none of this has gone the way we expected in Ukraine. A lot of us thought it would be like a so-called mini invasion or in and out, or maybe just in the Russian enclave. But I did not expect a full-on invasion of Ukraine. I also did not expect, maybe I should have, and this shows how little I know about the region, that the Ukrainian people would fight back so hard and so proudly. And I think that Putin seems surprised by that too. And maybe Xi Jinping is as well. You know, a lot of people have been saying, especially those in this country who want to bash the Biden administration for being weak, that Xi Jinping would see what happens in Ukraine and use that as a moment to take Taiwan. I think Xi Jinping may be looking at what's happening in Ukraine and having second thoughts about moving on Taiwan too soon. I definitely think he's learning at Russia's expense, letting Russia make its mistakes and learn how not to make the same mistakes were he to move on Taiwan. But I think the resilience of the Ukrainian people could give him reason for pause. It also sets the bar and standard very high for Taiwanese on how to defend their own territory if it were attacked, you know, in terms of civilian training, munitions training, willing to stand up. So the Ukrainians are an inspiration, but they've really set this standard very high for us around the world.
So thank you for your thoughts there. Now you said that there's a little bit of a lesson on the part of Taiwan here, just watching it from afar. You commented generally on sort of the Taiwan's resolve to defend its own territories. Now, is there other specific lessons that Taiwan can draw from what's happening in Ukraine right now?
Well, Taiwan's energy situation is rather precarious, especially with the blackout we recently saw in Kaohsiung. And the first few days of the Ukraine invasion, I was thinking, as some have suggested, maybe now's the time to reconsider nuclear energy for Taiwan. But then I saw Russian troops shooting at a nuke plant in Ukraine, and I'm thinking maybe that's not such a good idea after all. But I think, a lesson would be, I'm not one of these guys who goes around saying Taiwan needs to do more for its own defense, spend more money. I'll leave that to the military experts. But in terms of national service, every house being ready to fight, in terms of mobilizing the population, there's a lot to learn and be inspired by from Ukraine. And I think Taiwan can take this moment to make itself appear and be even more indispensable to the outside world than it already is. Taiwan has a tough time branding itself. Taiwan can't even be sure what to call itself. Is it Taiwan, the Republic of China? Is it Chinese Taipei? Right. What's on the passport? What are you in the Olympics? And, we see South Korea has so many corporate brands, and Taiwan has traditionally, until recently, been more of an original equipment manufacturer, people not knowing that the parts are even from Taiwan. But I think that that's, appropriate for Taiwan, because Taiwan itself doesn't even know what to call itself. So how can its brands know how to brand themselves? So I think Taiwan needs to take this time to make itself indispensable and needed for the outside world. So should this terrible day ever come, your average person in Milwaukee or Stockholm or Johannesburg says, yeah, we need to keep Taiwan free and safe, and not have, if you have to explain it to them, it's already too late.
Right.
And we've seen some of that, certainly, in the pandemic and the need for electronics and semiconductors. We've seen that in the electronics sector, people are really appreciating how important Taiwan is. And that's why TSMC, without commenting on any one country, it's great that a brand from Taiwan is now a household name, especially when it has the T for Taiwan in its name. So that's a really good step, as opposed to saying, hey, this joystick from Atari was made by Hunhai, but I don't know that, right? So the Taiwan getting itself out there.
Right.
Right. Well, I mean, I think one thing I'm kind of curious, you know, because especially beyond the military side of things, Taiwan has been sort of tightly woven into the ecosystem of the world, and I guess I'm trying to draw a parallel between like the Mittelstand of Germany. You know, a lot of mid-sized companies, they are like critical, but they are not known. So I guess, Sean, I'm sort of pushing back a bit here. It's, you know, the relationship between the, say, awareness of Germany is not because of the BMW, not. That will be my argument. But, you know, people understand how important it is. But, you know, in terms of
but Germany, right. But Germany has defined borders, and Germany knows what to call itself, and nobody else is threatening to invade Germany or claiming it for itself.
Right.
And in addition to the Mittelstand firms, you also have the major corporates like Siemens, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, Bosch, whatever else.
Right.
So Germany doesn't have the same identity issues that Taiwan does.
Good point.
Right.
Good point.
Right. No, I think that's a very fair point, and I guess that this is perfect segue into sort of the main topic. I know. I think again, you know, not to put words in your mouth, Sean, but you know, just the nebulous nature of the state, however we define it, as it relates to Taiwan, makes gray zone conflict even more complicated. And so I think, you know, again, you know, how we kind of got the conversation started was because there's been a fair number of conversation, especially in the military worlds around the world, about, you know, what if a gray zone conflict were to happen whereby PLA accidentally stumble onto the Pratas Island and just take over, and then what happens, right? You know, because nobody wants to escalate the confrontation, but at the same time, it would be a de facto violation of the boundary of Taiwan, as it were.
Well, maybe the Taiwan area, the Republic of China, but not Taiwan proper.
Okay, no, that's a good start.
Yes, very nuanced point.
If they take it over, then I guess it wouldn't be very accidental, now would it? I mean, you can accidentally land somewhere, but you don't accidentally take over.
Or maybe overzealous Chinese fishermen, well equipped and somehow encouraged by PLA Navy, something like that.
I mean, I go crazy when I see on the news 40 planes fly through Taiwan airspace.
Right.
First of all, it's not the airspace, it's the Air Defense Identification Zone.
Right.
And then most of these flights, if not all, are not over Taiwan proper. They're over places like Pratas Island, which is historically not Taiwanese. You know, Pratas Island is historically part of Guangdong province and forms part of the Republic of China's 11-dash line from this 1947 KMT map, on which Beijing bases its own 9-dash line, which is so notorious today. Of course, during the Cold War, Beijing cut 2 dashes off that line in deference to communist brother state Vietnam. If you believe Xi Jinping, and I'm not saying Xi Jinping's a trustworthy, likable guy, but if you listen consistently to PRC propaganda, what they say their red line is formal Taiwanese independence. We still have this myth, if you will, the Republic of China, that it's a Chinese state, and something like Pratas Island ties that mythical ROC government to some kind of Chinese lineage. If Beijing's goal is to prevent Taiwanese independence at all costs, why would they want to make the proportion of area under Taipei's jurisdiction less historically Chinese? For those people on Taiwan who still identify as Chinese and still believe in the ROC, losing something like Pratas would make them feel only less of a connection. It would make Taiwan only more Taiwanese. And that's why I think the PLA will fly over a place like Pratas to test, to probe, to stress, to see how Taiwan reacts, to see how the US reacts. It would not be in the mainland's interest to seize that because it would only make the area under Taipei's jurisdiction proportionately more Taiwanese. I can imagine a lot of deep green Taiwanese saying, good, take it. What do we care? Like if you're a deep green Taiwanese, why do you want Pratas Island? That only ties you to Chiang Kai-shek's legacy from before Taiwan was really Taiwan. So I see Beijing having no incentive to actually seize one of those islands. And the same goes for Matsu and Fujian and Jinmen, because those islands are historically Fujianese. And it was very important to Chiang Kai-shek that he keep control of those islands because it allowed him to rule over a part of what he considered China that was not only Taiwan. Because so long as he had those two islands, he could say, I'm a Chinese leader, and not a Taiwanese leader. And I noticed, one more point I got to make. I've been waiting to tell someone this for 7 years. In 2015, when Ma Ying-jeou went to Singapore to meet Xi Jinping, and they went Dutch on drinks, and they brought their own drinks to dinner. Ma brought Galian liquor from Jinmen and rice wine from Ma. And I got crazy when like outlets were saying Ma brought his own Taiwanese drinks. Those were not Taiwanese drinks. Those were Fujianese drinks. That was, to me, I took that from Ma being deep blue KMT, his way of saying, I'm not a Taiwanese leader, I'm a Chinese leader.
No, that's actually very...
want something from Taiwan proper.
Yes, that's a very subtle point you picked up. In fact, if I recall my history, I think the idea of letting, quote unquote, letting Chiang Kai-shek keep both Matsu and Jinmen was a little bit of a political calculation on the part of Chairman Mao back then, where they don't cut the umbilical cord between the Chinese on Taiwan and the Chinese in China. So that's a very good point that you brought up. That was, at the end of the day, it was a very, very political decision.
Because there was no Taiwanese independence movement on Taiwan at the time, but it was under martial law. But there was always this fear, I think, in Beijing that the U.S. might push Formosa into some kind of UN trusteeship like South Korea, and that there may be, some kind of separation for Taiwan in the cards in the State Department. So that's why I think both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong had an interest in the ROC in control over Matsu and Fujian. And also going back to Ma Ying-jeou, you may remember in 2016, before he left office, he made a trip to Aba in the South China Sea that was criticized by the U.S. State Department, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Who's the only government that praised Ma's trip?
Guess who?
The PRC.
Yeah, the PRC.
They said, it was a compatriot going to take their Chinese territory. So Beijing has a propaganda interest in Taipei keeping its 11-line claim, because if Taipei were to revoke it, then what is the Beijing claim based on? Now, possession's 9/10 of the law. I think they're going to keep their they're going to keep their fake islands no matter what. But it makes for much better history and propaganda if Taipei keeps this claim too. So it's worth noting Beijing was the only government to effectively praise Ma's trip to that disputed island in 2015.
Right. Well, I think Sean, you brought up a very interesting point. I mean, again, your point is very well taken, just sort of in terms of the political interaction, the delicate dance between PRC and the government, whoever's in charge in Taiwan. But that's, about one dimension. So again, with understanding you're not speaking on behalf of, the current U.S. government, but just looking at the U.S. interest, everything else being equal, whatever that is, the interaction level is between Taiwan and China, what would be quote unquote a dominant strategy for the U.S.? For example, I mean, would it make sense for the U.S. to just kind of nudge the Taiwan government and say, dude, man, just give out the Pratas Island. What do you care?
I've thought that, but at the same time, if Taipei gave it up, the PRC would get another notch in its belt in the South China Sea and another island. And it would be bad for Vietnam and the Philippines. And it would increase PRC domination. So while I think intellectually, people who understand this issue in the US government ask themselves why Taiwan bothers, or Taipei bothers, I should say. But if they were to give it up, it would mean it would go to the PRC, and in practical military terms, that would make things more complicated. So I think the ideal U.S. situation would be Taipei, give it up, admit you don't want it, but just don't leave right now.
I see. So it's for an even larger game. It's at a regional level that, it's not just between the Taiwan and China, but, Philippines and Vietnam's and right. Wow. Okay. So yeah, go ahead.
That's why it's so complicated. But not to put words in your mouth, Sean, do you think then by default, it's almost like the dominant strategy, as Uncle Sam put it, is actually to preserve the status quo?
Or the ambiguity
in the South China Sea?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the status quo is, because the status quo right now is pretty bad. The status quo in the South China Sea, and we can't conflate the Taiwan Strait issue with the South China Sea. That's another thing that gets me crazy. Those are two totally separate issues, as with the Senkakus, which I know we're going to get to. But the status quo seems to get worse every day, and the status quo of 2022 is far worse than the status quo of 2021 or even 2016, when the Hague Tribunal Award was given to Manila, that Rigor Duterte himself didn't even want to take. And, he couldn't take a victory because he was trying to sever his ties with America and make good with Putin and Xi. Right. So, no, I think the status quo is pretty bad in the South China Sea. But I guess for now, we just want to stop any more territory going to the PRC, even if that means we don't agree with Taipei having that. At least it's better than Beijing having it. So just sort of put it to the side and deal with it later.
Right. So
it's worth noting that it's worth noting that when we had the Sino-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty, which was in effect until 1980, it only applied to Taiwan and Penghu, Taiwan proper and Penghu. Jinmen and Matsu were not covered under the Sino-U.S. Defense Treaty.
Really?
Because we were really worried Chiang Kai-shek was going to trick us into a shooting match that we'd have to defend. So if Jinmen and Matsu weren't in it, I doubt Pratas Island or Ituaba were in it anyway. I think, the U.S. would probably come to Taiwan's defense if Taipei did not provoke the fight, if it's on Taiwan proper. But I can't see any situation under which the U.S. Would waste any time defending Pratas Island. And if we bring Thai, just assume not have it anyway.
Right. So I guess this
is probably also a good segue, since you brought up Senkaku Island.
Yeah, go ahead. Senkaku Island.
Yeah. So Senkaku Island, you want to so let me set the stage here again. Some crazy, overzealous fishermen from China, fishermen, backed by whoever, just decided to take action into his or her own hands, and then take the rock over in Senkaku and plant a flag there. So what happens next?
Well, I mean, if it's really just a fisher person with a trawler, that's one thing. But let's, for purposes of this high-minded intellectual podcast, let's say it's PLA, or let's say there's something more sinister. It's pretty black and white. I mean, the U.S. is obligated to defend the Senkakus. So, it's always been considered that the Senkaku Islands fall under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty. So, unfortunately, the U.S. does not take a position on ownership of the Senkakus. I wish we would. I wish we would say outright they're Japanese, but that's another story for another day. Every president after they left office would later say at some think tank or panel that, yes, the Senkakus are covered under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty. Obama was the first president to say so when he was in office in 2014. And most people saw that as an exchange for Japan joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that was something to give Abe Shinzo that he could take home to his conservative base, saying it's worth to open up the agricultural market because we got a sitting U.S. president to commit to defending the Senkakus, which since 2010 in Japan has been a very serious issue. So there's no strategic ambiguity here. The U.S. has a legal defense, a legal obligation to defend the Senkaku Islands where they attacked by the PLA, and Taiwan has nothing to do with it. Beijing and Taipei, both wrongly as I see it, claim that the Senkaku Islands appertain to Taiwan, Yilan County, in fact. So while Beijing would suffer certain military blowback. Military, it would not make sense because the U.S. has an obligation to fight back, which we probably wouldn't were Pratas. So Pratas is an easier get. Senkaku basically invites war. Ideologically, it would make more sense for Beijing to seize the Senkakus.
Right.
Because that is actually, in their propaganda, that is part of Taiwan. Right. So they would be taking, and because they say it's Taiwan, and because Taipei does them a favor by also claiming it, they then say, because it's Taiwan, it's ours. So for them, it's what we call a
right.
Because if you even entertain the notion that the Senkakus are part of China, how do you then say that Taiwan's not part of China? And this is what I ask my Taiwanese friends. You know, you're falling into Beijing's trap here. So it ideologically, from a PRC propaganda point of view, it makes more sense for them to take the Senkakus, but not militarily, because it would invite a certain U.S. counterstrike.
Well, it's probably worthy to point out that former President Lee Teng-hui actually, after he left the office, did publicly claim that Senkaku is not part of Taiwan, or ROC. So in that, along that vein, I think, you know, former President Lee Teng-hui was thinking along the same lines that as your you know, sort of statement just now, that, you know, it is actually not part of Taiwan.
Right. And well, we all know Lee Teng-hui's affinity for Japan.
Of course.
Yes.
Of course.
And where he would go to Osaka for his heart treatment and dress in cosplay. And I'm very proud to say, you know, Lee Teng-hui has always been my favorite Taiwan leader. And he got his PhD at Cornell. I didn't go to Cornell, but he did live in New York for a few years. So I'm very, so we sort of claim him as an honorary New Yorker, or at least New York State resident. As of his
Absolutely.
Indeed.
So, you know, in January of 1895, Japan incorporated the Senkakus as terra nullius into Okinawa Prefecture. And then in April of 1895, it took Taiwan and appertaining islands and rocks at the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which it then turned back after World War II. Now, Beijing and Taipei say that the Senkakus were part of that, but Japan makes the valid point, I think, that they were incorporated 3 months before the Treaty of Shimonoseki. So why, and, you know, from the KMT point of view, ideologically, Ma even did a thesis on this. I think when he was at NYU or Harvard, one of his advanced degrees, he did a thesis on this issue. You know, if you're KMT Deep Blue, I can see why you're into this. But it also doesn't surprise me that the DPP, whenever they're in power, they're like, it's you know, they're like reading off a paper. They're like, okay, next. Like, you know, like,
perfunctory.
What strategic interest is it in Taiwan to dispute this? You know, when Japan is your second most important partner. And the first U.S. defense of Taiwan would come from Okinawa. So, you know, our ships would have to pass by anyway. And then Lee Teng-hui very famously in 2015 did say that, you know, they're Japanese as far as he's concerned. So there you go.
Right. Well, you know, I think sort of taking all this in context, and, you know, I think we just barely touch on the complexity and the multidimensionality of this game. So it seems like there's a fair amount of posturing from both sides, and, you know, you want to do a very delicate dance. So how, I guess, you know, from the more American perspective, you know, the U.S. military having presence in Korea and Japan, and you know, with interest in Southeast Asia, and, you know, so how do the two sides match up? It just, you know, how is this kabuki dance being conducted?
Well, I mean, of course, America never postures. We just speak truth. So
indeed,
of course,
indeed,
never.
of course. But yeah, I mean, that's another thing to keep in mind. And, you know, again, I don't want to draw these false parallels, but going back to the earlier discussion with Ukraine, you know, we have 28,500 troops in South Korea, and we have 50,000 in Japan, and we have Guam and Hawaii nearby. And that's another reason Western Pacific governments like Palau and Marshall Islands essential that we keep those diplomatic relationships with Taipei because we want to stop the PLA Navy from being there to sort of intercept U.S. ships coming to Taiwan's rescue from the east.
Good point.
So it's a big picture, and one of the best things that Biden did when he came into office immediately was to extend for 5 years at a 14% increase, as opposed to Trump, who was basically extorting them to be U.S. troops in South Korea.
Right.
And he did a 1-year extension with Japan based on their legislative schedule. And now we just increased it another 5 years. So, and, Trump put 100 military trainers or instructors in Taiwan, which Biden has now doubled to 200. So I think, there's a lot going on. I think the U.S. is clearly committed to the region. I would just appreciate if people took the time, especially when talking about Taiwan and these islands and gray zone conflicts, to sort of take the time to study what is actually Taiwan and what is not, and what is part of the Republic of China, Taiwan area, and what is Taiwan proper. And, with the Senkakus, I just don't know why Taipei wastes its time on this issue. We should be trying to get as close to Japan as possible. We're in this together, Taiwan, Japan, and America. So the less daylight we can have among the three of us, the better.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think that's a very, very good thought there. In a way, I was going to ask a question you sort of kind of answered already, which is like, not that any one of the gray zone action that we talked about, potentially would happen, but should any one of them happen, what is the sort of the, appropriate counter move on the part of the grand alliance of, U.S., Korea, Japan, and Taiwan?
I think Korea would have no interest in getting involved. Korea, the best we could hope for from Korea is an understanding that were a Taiwan contingency to break out, we may need to take some of our troops from there and use it for logistics.
Sure.
But, Korea sees itself as a shrimp among whales.
Yeah.
And even under a conservative government, I don't think they would join the Quad or too strongly oppose Beijing, because they still think mainland China is going to help solve the North Korea problem for them. Although, as far as I can see it, Beijing is the reason Korea remains divided, but that's another podcast.
Sure.
So I think Korea wants to be left alone and not get involved, especially if it's good for Japan. Then they just think it must be bad. Japan, I think, would not put troops on Taiwan, but they would certainly play a very helpful logistical role, supporting U.S. troops and maybe taking in Taiwanese refugees, help with refueling, and doing other things on the ground for our troops. But it's not for me to say how would we react in one of these things. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think the most dangerous of the scenarios we've discussed were if the PLA were to seize one of the Senkaku Islands, because there's really not much room for nuance there.
Right.
I mean, obviously, we're not going to go to war unless we want to. We have a treaty obligation through NATO to Denmark. But if Sweden, for some reason, attacks Denmark tomorrow, we're not necessarily sending the cavalry into Copenhagen. Obviously, that's not going to happen, but I'm just making
Don't worry.
And, is this something I haven't heard, about Denmark? Anyway, go ahead.
Well, no, I was actually a high school exchange student in Sweden, and I lived in a part of Sweden.
Oh, there you go.
So
okay.
there's a lot of teasing back and forth. That's for my friends over there. They'll get the joke. But, if PLA were to seize one of the Senkakus, I mean, it's pretty much there in U.S. law with Japan that we would come to Japan's defense. So I've always considered, among all these hypotheticals, the East China Sea to be the most potentially dangerous. That would be, and again, that would have nothing to do with Taiwan. That would be U.S. defending Japan against the PRC. And there's pure strategic clarity in that case.
Right,
That's always been considered. I've always considered that the most explosive potential.
Right. Wow, this is absolutely fascinating because I must confess, when I was reading about all this analysis on gray zone conflict and people was talking more militarily, what are the considerations? But Sean, really appreciate, sort of you having this grand strategic view of how the different pieces fit together, because I meant this in as a high compliment. It's like now I'm even more confused because there are so many pieces in action. So anyway, so I think our time is coming up. Again, Sean, really appreciate your insight, and when your schedule allows, we'd love to bring you back and share more your insights. So
I would love that.
Great.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. 哇，真的很感谢 Sean King 这么精辟的跟我们分析这个不管是乌克兰还是台湾，然后我必须承认，就是说他讲很多东西不是听不懂，可是从来没有从一个他不是美国官方，可是他是很了解美国官方的思维，他的点是什么？我觉得有时候这时候就让我想起那个老梗，就是你要穿的对方的鞋走1里路才会知道对方在想什么。那真的谢谢那个Sean把鞋子借给我穿了一下，这样子虽然没有走1里路啦，我走2步就觉得好重啊。
就是说那个像用美国观点，然后果然是美帝啊，他的棋盘够大，这样子那个从欧洲看回到亚洲，然后再看回到欧洲，是那种真的是视野够宏观啦。
是，而且就也是很有趣。我想乌克兰现在大家也都是每天新闻都有在报道。那他其实我们在录之前他就提到说，乌克兰跟台湾其实有很大的差别。那我相信，这次听Sean跟我们分析，可以看也听得出来了，就是说，从一个美国这种所谓世界大国的这个下棋是多个层面的下棋方法，光是这个东南亚海域的这件事情，它就是另外一个棋盘那台湾跟中国之间又是另外一台棋盘，然后再把日本、韩国就是很复杂这样子。所以不知道这个大主角觉得这边有什么 take away 吗？你觉得？
我觉得这个第一件事情当然就是像是很有经验，然后他也开宗明义讲，就是说，哎呀，这个其实说穿了，美国的所谓国家的国家利益在乌克兰跟在台湾其实是真的是不太一样哦。那当然就是说，我们整体看这个现在乌克兰发生的事情，我们就让我们想到说，其实有不一样的层次、不一样的角度可以看这事情。就是说，虽然是国家的利益在乌克兰，美国国家利益在乌克兰没有那么大来说，但是不管透过种种的媒体或者是人跟人的接触，似乎乌克兰事情还是占了很大的版面。至少在美国跟西欧各国，那我不知道大叔长这边有没有觉得这个对台湾有什么启示吗？
歧视我不知道，我觉得就是这很有趣了，就是说，因为台湾也是一个民主国家，那这个以后如果真的有什么事情的话，一般也会去找相对民主国家来帮忙。那这件事情，民主国家有好有坏，它的好处是人民是可以有声音的，可是国家对国家之间的利益考量还是以国为单位。那我想就说，以我们从坐在台湾来看乌克兰这件事情，我自己的反省就是说这件事情是两个层面，一个是国家与国家之间，就是说你乌克兰或者是你台湾的利用价值到底是多大，这个是很现实的。那可是另外一个就是在人民新闻报道，甚至你认识乌克兰的人，像我们上个礼拜就找了一个乌克兰的朋友教我们讲那个乌克兰的口号，这样子，就是人与人之间的关系是什么？那我觉得从一个民主政治的角度，选民的想法其实是非常重要的。那所以我觉得，就说从一个台湾，你可以对台湾做什么贡献？其实就很简单，你如果可以做到国家级的，那当然也不要客气。可是你就算是个人，你就算是私人，就像我们就找到跟乌克兰的朋友聊天，那我们当然就会比较挺乌克兰嘛。虽然说只是出张嘴而已，可是我好歹会出张嘴啊。
就是它就变成具体化，对人民来讲，国家利益大家都知道是什么，但是它比较没有温度。但是当人民跟人民能够有接触的时候，其实那种支持、那种 情绪上或者是情感上的一些连结跟交流就比较直接有温度，然后就可以很现实的感觉到。那比如说就像刚刚大叔讲的，就是说其实我们不管跟乌克兰的就是说民间的交流或是民间的友人这样子一连结以后就有温度。然后我看到台湾也是包括全世界很多地方，就是这几个周末都连续有好几个这种像是为了和平而就在街头上一些小小的走一下，然后就是透过民主的机制，透过媒体啊等等，让不要说施压了，就是让各个民主的政府能够更正视这件事情。
对，就是不过当然话说来，这就把事情搞得更复杂一点。不过这个时候呢，就是坐在台湾看热闹这样子。
对，其实说实在，这件事情对台湾当然还是很远啦，就是从地理的位置或者是其他的一些连结来讲，还是很远。但是因为台湾自己的状况，所以台湾很多人还是感同身受，所以这也是一个蛮有趣的现象。
是。那所以我们这个今天也再次感谢 Sean 跟我们分享这么有趣的看法，从一个比较政治，从一个政策的角度看这件事情。那我们下礼拜当然就是还是会不是下礼拜我们等一下再讲下礼拜的节目。对，所以讲下礼拜，我们下礼拜呢，因为前面2集讲的有点 heavy 这样子，想说轻松一下，对，所以那这个我们就去找了一下我们之前一个最有人气的节目，有找了几个这样子，所以我们下礼拜就是我们的所谓经典大家不知道记不记得子倩一个好朋友，在法国波尔多区的好朋友，然后就讨论到什么叫做自然酒，那也请大家期待。那我们听完自然酒之后，我们再来继续听这种非常 heavy 的这个台海关系灰色地带。OK， 好，那我们今天就先到这边了，谢谢，拜拜，
拜拜。
好的，那恭喜你又收听完了一集谢伯伯时间。那在节目正式结束之前呢，我们想要特别感谢一下我们的后制团队。那我们就先从感谢 Oliver， 没错，就是我自己，再来是 Ariel、Hannah、Lalisa， 当然还有大叔赏及大叔甲。如果你喜欢我们的节目的话，也欢迎订阅、留5颗星、按赞以及留言分享你的想法。最后，在这段疫情里，大家要好好照顾自己与身边的人，祝福大家平安健康。那我们就下集再见咯，拜拜。